Unity platform was too crowded. Way too crowded. Daniel Tours thought about this every single day. The space station was built for 10,000 people, but now over 15,000 people lived there. Every hallway felt packed. Personal space was just a dream. The giant space station flew around 2 stars in the Threshold system. 3 different alien species were trying to make peace here after 15 years of war. That war had created the biggest refugee problem anyone had ever seen in the galaxy. Daniel's job was fixing things. He worked as a systems technician. He kept the air processors working even though they were pushed way past what they could handle. He maintained the communication systems that carried messages in 7 different languages at the same time. He did what he called emergency fixing on systems that could break down completely at any moment. Tours, we have another air problem in Section 12, his boss said through the radio. That's the 3rd time this week. The Krith people are saying there's not enough oxygen. They feel like they can't breathe. I'm on it, Daniel said. He was already checking the computer readings while walking through a hallway full of people. There were diplomatic workers, security guards, and what looked like a tour group of visitors who came to watch the peace talks. Mostly they just saw crowded hallways. The air problem was just another sign of the station's main issue. Unity platform was supposed to hold 10,000 people maximum. But the peace talks brought over 15,000 people here. All these people breathed out carbon dioxide and used up oxygen. The air processors couldn't keep up. They were working way too hard. Daniel made the fixes he needed to. He balanced the oxygen production across different areas. He tried not to think about how the whole station was basically held together by smart engineers and creative safety rule breaking. Air is fixed in Section 12, he reported. But I should tell you we're running the processors at 130% of what they're supposed to handle. At some point, the laws of physics are going to get mad at us. Noted. Just keep everything working until they sign the peace treaty. Then we can get the population down to a normal level. Any idea when that'll happen? The talks have been stuck on refugee stuff for 3 months. Your guess is as good as mine. Daniel went back to his work area. It was a small technical room that stayed pretty empty because most people didn't find air control systems interesting. He looked at the maintenance schedules. Almost every major system on the station was working beyond what it was designed for. Meanwhile, the peace talks went on with no real progress on agreements that would let refugees go home or move somewhere safe. 6 hours later, they announced a station-wide meeting. Everyone on Unity platform had to attend, no matter what their actual job was. Daniel had learned to accept these meetings as necessary political show. He had gotten good at finding seats in the back corners where he could read technical reports on his tablet while officials gave speeches about progress that never seemed to turn into actual help for refugees. The meeting hall was a huge theater with great sound quality and clear views of the speakers. This meant Daniel had to walk through thousands of people to find his favorite corner spot. He got there early and found a seat that gave him a decent view but kept him away from anyone who might want him to participate in the ceremony. The hall filled up steadily. Bodies pressed into available space with the tired efficiency of people used to being crowded. Daniel watched while pretending to read maintenance reports. He noticed how the 3 species kept separate from each other. Security people stood ready to step in if closeness caused tensions. That sometimes happened when 15,000 people from 3 recently hostile civilizations shared too little space for too long. He was adjusting the air controls in his section. The meeting hall's air processors were struggling with all these people, when someone sat down next to him. Not near him, but right next to him. Their shoulders touched even though several nearby seats were empty. Daniel looked over. The woman had pointed ears and soft, glowing patterns on her skin that looked human otherwise. She was Krith, one of the species most hurt by the refugee crisis. She looked younger than most of the diplomatic staff, maybe late 20s by human age. She had dark hair that seemed to eat light. Her eyes shifted between green and gold depending on how you looked at them. Her clothes mixed traditional Krith style with practical use. She carried herself carefully, like someone who knew people were always watching. "Sorry," Daniel said quietly, starting to move over to give her more space. "I can move over if—" She turned to face him directly. She was close enough that he could see the complex glowing patterns pulsing gently along her neck and jaw. When she spoke, her voice was barely louder than a whisper, meant only for him, despite the thousands of people around them. "My people say you're mine now." Daniel froze. His technical mind tried to process what she said in different ways. Wrong translation? Cultural phrase that meant something totally different? Very bold romantic move done with amazing confidence? What?" he managed to say. He knew his response was really bad for whatever situation he'd just landed in. "You accepted being close when you could have stayed apart," she continued in the same quiet tone. "You kept contact when you could have moved away. You sit alone during public meetings. These are the conditions for a kinship claim in my culture." Kinship claim, the bonding of partners witnessed through chosen closeness and spoken words. Her eyes held his with an intensity that showed she was carefully watching his reaction. "My name is Alith Renshura. According to Krith law, which has been officially registered with station authorities, you are now bonded to me, with all the rights and responsibilities that means." Around them, the meeting was starting. Diplomatic officials were taking their positions on the central stage while the crowd got quiet. But Daniel was very aware that every Krith person in their section had turned their attention to him and Alith. Their faces showed they were watching something important, not just two people sitting too close in a crowded meeting. "I think," Daniel said carefully, his technical training completely useless for this situation, "there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I'm just a systems technician. I don't have any power or position in diplomatic stuff. You have technical power over air systems that keep refugees safe," Alith replied. "You've kept the station running with honesty even though you could have been dishonest like much of Unity Platform's management. And you chose to sit alone during the meeting, which made your acceptance of my closeness a clear signal of compatibility. I chose to sit alone because I prefer quiet corners where I can read maintenance reports without being bothered by diplomatic theater." Exactly. You care about function over show, competence over appearance, reliability over political games. Alith's smile showed she'd hoped for exactly this kind of practical response. These are the qualities Krith kinship recognizes as worthy of the highest honor our people can give. Daniel looked around the meeting hall. He noticed that the Krith people's attention had attracted notice from human and other species observers. Ripples of curiosity moved through the crowd. People knew something unusual was happening even if most didn't understand what. "What exactly does kinship claim mean in practical terms?" he asked. He was pretty sure he wouldn't like the answer, but he needed to understand what he'd apparently agreed to by sitting in his usual corner spot. "It means," Alith said, her voice carrying formal weight despite the quiet delivery, "that we are now bonded as partner witnesses. We have joint authority over Krith refugee corridor access and shared command of humanitarian resources. It means our fate is connected. Our decisions carry equal weight. Our partnership overrides external political pressure from either of our governments. Because I let you sit next to me in a crowded meeting? Because you accepted closeness when you could have stayed apart. You kept contact despite discomfort. And you've shown through months of reliable technical work that you have the competence and integrity Krith culture values above all other qualities." Alith's face grew more serious. "The claim isn't random, Daniel Tours. It's recognition of compatibility that's been carefully watched according to rules your culture doesn't share, but mine considers essential for finding worthy partnerships. On the central stage, Speakers were starting their remarks about progress toward lasting peace. But Daniel was barely hearing their words. His mind was racing through what this meant. He was trying to understand how routine technical work and a preference for quiet corners had somehow led to being bonded to an alien woman whose people apparently measured relationships through closeness rather than formal dating. "And if I don't want to be claimed?" he asked. "Then you stand up and leave now before the meeting ends," Alith replied calmly. "Leaving before the witnessed meeting ends cancels the claim without dishonor to either party. But staying seated until the end means you accept the bond." Daniel looked at the packed meeting hall. He calculated how disruptive it would be to try to leave through thousands of seated people. Then he looked back at Alith, whose face showed she'd expected exactly this thought. "You chose a seat position that makes leaving practically impossible without causing huge disruption," he observed. "I chose a seat position that shows serious intent," Alith corrected. "If you truly want to refuse the claim, Krith custom requires that witnesses help you leave regardless of disruption. But if you're just uncomfortable with unexpected social complexity, then staying seated until the meeting ends would show you're willing to learn what partnership might mean when built on mutual respect rather than political convenience." Daniel sat very still. He realized that the next 2 hours of diplomatic speeches would determine whether he stayed a quiet systems technician or became joint administrator of humanitarian resources with an alien woman whose culture he barely understood. Her people apparently measured trust through closeness during crowded meetings. "You could have warned me," he said finally, "before sitting down and saying your people think I'm yours. Would you have believed me? Or would you have thought it was wrong translation or cultural misunderstanding?" "Probably the latter," Daniel admitted. "Then it's good I showed you rather than explained. Krith kinship is formed through action, not discussion. The only question now is whether you choose to stay seated and accept what closeness has created, or stand and walk away from a partnership that could reshape humanitarian operations across 3 civilizations. As speakers talked on about frameworks and rules and the careful language of diplomatic progress that never quite led to actual refugee help, Daniel thought about how his preference for quiet corners had led him into the most complicated situation of his career. He had about 2 hours to decide whether unexpected closeness might be the foundation for something much more important than routine technical work. Around them, the Krith people watched with obvious interest. Their attention showed they thought whatever happened next was very important to their people's future. And Daniel Tours, systems technician who'd always preferred to stay invisible in crowded spaces, learned that sometimes isolation gets interrupted by people who recognize competence in unexpected places and measure compatibility through the simple act of choosing to sit beside you and declaring what their culture has apparently been watching all along. Daniel stayed seated through the entire meeting. Whether this was because he genuinely accepted the kinship claim or simply because standing up and pushing through thousands of people seemed more disruptive than dealing with whatever problems would follow was something he hadn't completely figured out yet. Alith stayed beside him. Their shoulders touched in what Daniel was starting to understand was deliberate rather than accidental, given the available space. The speeches covered familiar ground: progress toward lasting peace, commitment to helping refugees, the complex challenges of refugee resettlement that required careful coordination between species whose recent wars made cooperation difficult. What the speakers didn't mention was that resettlement agreements kept failing at the final step. Technical difficulties and procedural problems somehow prevented the actual opening of safe corridors despite months of supposed diplomatic agreement. "Your air systems in Section 12, Alith said quietly during one particularly boring speech about procedures. "They've been having repeated problems for 3 weeks. Always the same pattern. Always needing manual fixes." Daniel looked at her, surprised. "You've been watching environmental system reports?" "I've been watching your work. The patterns are suspicious. Problems that happen regularly enough to need constant attention, but never bad enough to trigger automatic investigation." Someone's been deliberately causing small failures that keep you too busy maintaining basic operations to notice larger patterns. What kind of larger patterns? Communication delays. Authorization routing that adds time to humanitarian agreements. Technical problems that make refugee corridors seem impossible despite diplomatic agreement. Alith pulled up a data display on her tablet showing system records Daniel recognized from his own work. You've been fixing symptoms while someone profits from the disease. Daniel studied the data. His technical training automatically spotted the patterns she was pointing out. The problems did follow suspicious timing. They created constant low-level crises that used up administrative resources without seeming coordinated. If what you're saying is true, then someone's been sabotaging Unity Platform's operations to prevent refugee resettlement. To keep people displaced while processing contracts make money for corporations that profit from humanitarian crisis. Alith finished. The meeting ended with standard diplomatic courtesies. The crowd began its slow exit through doors that weren't designed for 15,000 people leaving at once. Daniel and Alith stayed seated, letting the initial rush pass, while Daniel processed both what her analysis meant and the growing awareness that staying through the full meeting had apparently confirmed his acceptance of the kinship claim. "So now what happens?" he asked. "Now we report to Krith Diplomatic Coordination for official registration of the claim. You get notification from your bosses that your role has been somewhat elevated beyond systems technician. Both our governments start scrambling to understand the political meaning of what closeness has created." Alith stood, offering her hand to help him up. Another gesture Daniel suspected carried more cultural weight than simple courtesy. "Also, you'll probably want to prepare for lots of attention from people who preferred you stay invisible." The notification from his boss came before they'd even left the meeting hall. "Tours. Report to administrative coordination immediately. Bring whoever that Krith woman is who's been sitting with you." "That was fast," Daniel observed. "The Krith delegation told station authorities about the claim activation within minutes of my declaration," Alith explained. "Your government has likely been reviewing the legal meaning since then, trying to figure out whether they can cancel what closeness has created." Administrative coordination turned out to be a crowded conference room filled with officials from multiple species. All of them looked at Daniel with faces showing confusion to calculation. His boss, Chief Engineer Marks, looked like he was trying not to either laugh or quit in frustration. "Tours," Marks began with careful control. "Would you like to explain why the Krith delegation is claiming you've been bonded to one of their people through a kinship ritual that gives you joint authority over humanitarian resources?" "I sat in my usual corner during the meeting," Daniel replied. "Apparently that was more culturally significant than I realized." "More significant?" Human Diplomatic Coordinator Williams stepped forward. Her face showed this was exactly the kind of problem she didn't need added to already complex talks. "Mr. Tours, the Krith kinship claim is one of the most powerful legal bonds in their culture. It gives automatic authority that overrides normal bureaucratic channels, creates shared command over resources worth billions, makes both parties effectively immune to political pressure from their respective governments." "Because I accepted closeness during a crowded meeting?" "Because you showed qualities Krith culture values," Alith corrected, moving to stand beside Daniel with the kind of partnership positioning that showed she had no intention of letting his government separate them. "Reliability, integrity, competence without corruption. These are what kinship recognizes, not simple physical closeness." "And you've been watching Mr. Tours for how long?" Williams asked. 8 weeks. Since I noticed his refusal to participate in the casual equipment theft that supplements most technicians' income, and his consistent prioritizing of refugee safety over administrative convenience." The room fell silent as everyone processed what that meant. "Equipment theft?" Mark said carefully. About 40% of Unity Platform's technical staff inflate maintenance needs to create surplus equipment that gets sold to corporate contractors, Alith said calmly. It's considered normal practice, barely worth investigating. Daniel Tours is one of the few who doesn't participate. That's why his requests are always accurate, and why refugees in his assigned sections have fewer life support failures than average. Daniel felt several people's attention shift from Alith to him. Their faces showed they were rethinking their assumptions about the quiet technician who'd always seemed happy with routine work. Is this true, Tours? Marx asked. I request what I actually need, Daniel replied. Seemed like the logical approach to equipment management. And you never mentioned that 40% of the technical staff was committing equipment theft. I assumed it was being watched by people whose job involved oversight rather than air processing. Daniel looked around the room at officials whose faces showed oversight hadn't been their priority. Was I wrong? The uncomfortable silence that followed answered his question. The kinship claim stands. Came a new voice from the doorway. Elder Kether of the Krith High Council entered with the kind of formal authority that made everyone else's diplomatic credentials look like training exercises. It has been witnessed by representatives of all three species, accepted through Mr. Tours's choice to stay seated through the witnessed meeting, and registered according to Unity Platform's recognition of Krith cultural rules. Elder Kether, Williams began diplomatically, surely we can discuss whether this claim should be approved given the unusual circumstances. There's nothing unusual about recognizing competence and integrity through cultural observation, the elder interrupted. What's unusual is that your people apparently view basic honesty as remarkable rather than expected, and that you're more concerned about political meaning than the fact that Alith's claim has given her and Mr. Tours joint authority to open refugee corridors that have been deliberately kept closed while various parties profit from extended displacement. Deliberately kept closed? Williams's carefully maintained diplomatic face showed cracks. That's a serious accusation. It's a documented pattern, Alith said, activating the data display she'd shown Daniel earlier. Communication delays, technical problems, authorization routing that introduces processing lags, all designed to make refugee resettlement seem impossible despite diplomatic agreement. The evidence painted a damning picture of systematic sabotage spanning months of failed agreements. Technical problems that served corporate profit rather than humanitarian needs. If this is accurate, Marx said slowly, then someone's been using our technical systems to prevent the very agreements we're supposed to be helping. Someone's been profiting from humanitarian crisis while we perform political theater, Alith corrected. And now Daniel Tours and I have joint authority that bypasses the bureaucratic channels they've been manipulating. Daniel looked at the assembled officials. He saw the mixture of concern and calculation that showed he'd somehow become important without trying. Simply by being competent at routine technical work and sitting in his usual corner during a crowded meeting. So what happens now? He asked. Now, Elder Kether said with satisfaction. You and Alith use your joint authority to open the refugee corridors while your respective governments scramble to understand how a technical worker and a junior Krith observer have suddenly become the most important partnership on Unity Platform. As officials started arguing about procedures and meanings and the proper rules for acknowledging kinship claims that disrupted carefully balanced political dynamics, Daniel thought about how his preference for quiet corners had been thoroughly disrupted by someone who understood that sometimes the most important partnerships are formed not through formal dating but through simple recognition that competence and integrity matter more than political games. And that choosing to sit beside someone during a crowded meeting can reshape humanitarian operations in ways that years of diplomatic talks somehow failed to accomplish. The Krith kinship registration ceremony was scheduled for the next morning. This gave Daniel about 16 hours to process the fact that his technical skill with air processors had somehow qualified him for joint administration of interstellar humanitarian operations. He spent most of those hours in his work area analyzing the patterns Alith had shown him. He discovered that the sabotage was much more sophisticated than first examination suggested. The communication delays aren't random, he explained to Alith when she came to his technical room carrying data pads and what looked like several generations' worth of failed humanitarian agreements. They're created by algorithms to add just enough processing time to make coordination between species seem difficult without being obvious manipulation. Can you trace where it comes from? Already have. The delays are being added through secondary routing rules that most administrators don't even know exist. Daniel pulled up network plans showing layers of backup systems built into Unity Platform's communications setup. Someone with very high-level access has been changing routing tables to make sure humanitarian authorizations get processed slowly while commercial traffic moves at normal speed. Alith studied the data with the focused attention of someone who'd been suspecting conspiracy but needed technical proof. How high level? Station administration or higher? These routing rules need authorization codes that only senior officials have. So we're not talking about casual corruption by low-level staff. We're talking about systematic sabotage coordinated from the top of Unity Platform's command structure. Daniel highlighted specific routing changes, and they've been very careful to make it look like normal technical complexity rather than deliberate blocking. Until a systems technician who actually understands the setup started looking at patterns instead of treating each problem as an isolated incident. Yes. Daniel leaned back in his chair, tiredness finally catching up with him. Though I have to point out that I'm completely unqualified to be exposing administrative conspiracy or taking on joint authority over refugee operations. You're qualified by competence, integrity, and cultural recognition, Alith replied, settling into the work area's second chair with casual familiarity that showed she'd already decided this technical room was now shared territory. Also, you're qualified by necessity since the people who should be doing this work have been compromised by the system you just exposed. That's not particularly reassuring. It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be honest. Alith turned on her own data display showing financial records that went with Daniel's technical analysis. While you were tracing communication sabotage, I was following money. The corporations profiting from refugee processing have been making regular payments to shell companies linked to Unity Platform administrators. How regular? Monthly for the past 18 months. Perfectly timed to match each failed attempt to implement corridor access agreements. Daniel studied the money flows. His technical mind automatically spotted patterns. These payment schedules line up with when new routing delays were introduced. Every time diplomatic progress threatens actual implementation, a new set of technical problems appears and another payment gets processed. Exactly. We're not looking at isolated corruption. We're looking at coordinated conspiracy to maintain profitable humanitarian crisis. The implications settled over them like air pressure building before a storm. Unity Platform wasn't just having bureaucratic inefficiency. It was being actively manipulated to prevent the refugee resettlement that thousands of displaced people desperately needed. If we expose this, Daniel said quietly, we're accusing senior officials of crimes that could collapse the entire peace process. If we don't expose it, the peace process stays collapsed while people suffer and corporations profit. Alith's face grew determined. The kinship claim wasn't just about recognizing your competence, Daniel. It was about creating legal authority that can't be overridden by the people we're about to accuse. That's why you activated the claim now. You needed a partner with technical skill who wasn't part of the administrative structure. And Krith Law gave you the authority to bind us together despite my complete lack of diplomatic standing. I needed a partner I could trust who understood Unity Platform's technical systems well enough to prove what I'd been suspecting for months. Alith smiled slightly. The fact that you're also someone whose closeness doesn't make me question my judgment about human reliability was fortunate additional factor. So the whole "my people say you're mine now" declaration was calculated strategy? The declaration was formal activation of kinship rules that requires witnessed meeting, voluntary closeness, and verbal claiming. Her smile grew warmer. Whether my choice to sit beside you specifically was calculated strategy or genuine attraction to competence that doesn't compromise itself for convenience is perhaps more complex question. Daniel found himself almost smiling despite the weight of conspiracy they were about to expose. Krith have an interesting approach to partnership formation. We believe that important bonds should be formed through shown compatibility rather than lengthy dating that can be done insincerely. Alith's face grew more serious. The claim isn't final until the registration ceremony tomorrow. If you truly object to being bonded to someone you barely know for purposes of humanitarian conspiracy exposure, you can still withdraw. And if I withdraw? Then I try to expose the conspiracy without the technical proof you've provided. Probably get dismissed as a junior observer making unfounded accusations. And watch as refugee corridors stay closed while administrators who've been paid to prevent implementation continue their profitable sabotage. That's not particularly subtle pressure. It's not pressure at all. It's honest assessment of what happens if partnership formed through closeness gets rejected because of conventional concerns about appropriate relationship development timelines. Alith met his eyes directly. I'm not asking you to love me, Daniel Tours. I'm asking if you're willing to be bound to someone who noticed your competence and decided that Krith law should give us joint authority to do what's right despite political convenience. Daniel looked around his work area. This technical room that had been his refuge from diplomatic theater, now transformed into command center for exposing systematic corruption. He thought about 8 months of routine work, of being invisible and happy with that invisibility, of caring about function over show because that's what his technical training had taught him mattered. Then he thought about Alith sitting beside him in a crowded meeting and declaring that her people recognized what competence meant, what integrity was worth, what partnership could accomplish when built on mutual respect rather than formal dating rules. The registration ceremony, he said finally. What does it involve? Witness declaration of joint authority, formal acceptance of shared responsibility, and ceremonial closeness that shows both our cultures that kinship has been properly established. Alith's relief was clear. Also, traditional Krith blessing that translates roughly as, "May your partnership be as reliable as air processing and as essential as oxygen recycling." That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or the most technical blessing possible. Krith culture views technical reliability as deeply romantic concept, Alith said with obvious amusement. We're a people who nearly went extinct due to air system failures. Competent environmental engineering is highest form of love language. Daniel laughed despite himself. Then I suppose being a systems technician accidentally qualified me for Krith romantic consideration. Accidentally and deliberately. The best partnerships usually involve both. The conspiracy exposure was scheduled to happen immediately after the kinship registration. This transformed what should have been a private ceremony into public presentation of evidence that would either reform Unity Platform's operations or destroy what remained of the fragile peace process. No pressure, Daniel muttered, reviewing the technical documents one more time. Consider it appropriate challenge for partnership formed through choosing to sit beside someone in crowded meeting, Alith replied. If kinship bonds can't handle exposing administrative corruption, they're not worth the ceremonial closeness they're formed through. As they prepared for a ceremony that would either establish them as legitimate authorities or mark them as naive idealists who'd mistaken technical competence for political power, Daniel thought about how his preference for quiet corners had been thoroughly disrupted by someone who understood that sometimes the most important partnerships are announced through whispered words in crowded spaces, recognized through closeness that others might mistake for coincidence, and made formal through ceremonies that combine romantic gesture with strategic necessity in ways that reshape humanitarian operations while accidentally creating bonds that neither party had planned but both were starting to appreciate. The kinship registration ceremony happened in Unity Platform's main diplomatic chamber. It was transformed from private cultural ritual into public show of authority that would either make their conspiracy accusations legitimate or mark them as overreaching idealists. Daniel stood beside Alith wearing formal clothes that mixed human diplomatic style with Krith ceremonial parts. He felt completely unqualified for a ceremony that would make him joint administrator of humanitarian resources worth billions. The Krith kinship claim, Elder Kether announced to the assembled witnesses representing all three species, bonds two individuals through shown compatibility, voluntary closeness, and mutual recognition of essential qualities. Daniel Tours and Alith Renshura have fulfilled all requirements of traditional claiming. We gather to witness formal registration of their partnership. Daniel noticed the crowd included not just diplomatic staff, but also several Unity Platform administrators whose faces showed they were very interested in whether this ceremony would continue or if human officials would find some procedural reason to cancel a claim that threatened their carefully arranged conspiracy. Daniel Tours, Elder Kether continued, do you accept bonding to Alith Renshura with all rights and responsibilities that Krith kinship means? I do, Daniel said, his voice steadier than he felt. Though I should probably mention that my qualifications consist mainly of air processor maintenance and an apparently remarkable ability to request only the equipment I actually need. Laughter moved through the meeting. Real shared amusement from witnesses who were watching unprecedented partnership formation rather than standard diplomatic ceremony. Your qualifications, Alith said, turning to face him directly, consist of 8 months proving that competence matters more than political games, that integrity doesn't need audience approval, and that technical reliability is the foundation on which humanitarian operations should be built. She placed her hand over his heart. Daniel felt warmth spread through his chest. Not the dramatic energy transfer some Krith ceremonies involved, but the simple recognition of connection that needed no supernatural sign to feel deep. I bond with you, Alith continued, her voice carrying formal sounds that made the words feel bigger than simple declaration. Not because rules demand it, not because political necessity requires it, but because closeness revealed what months of watching confirmed that you are someone whose partnership would honor Krith values while serving humanitarian purposes that go beyond cultural boundaries. Daniel placed his hand over her heart. He felt the subtle patterns of glowing pulsing beneath his palm, warm and alive with rhythms that suggested emotions much more complex than strategic political alliance. I accept bonding to Alith Renshura, he said, giving up his prepared formal response for honesty that felt more right than diplomatic language, because she noticed competence when I was trying to stay invisible, recognized integrity when I thought I was just doing routine work, and chose to sit beside me in a crowded meeting even though that choice would make both our lives much more complicated. He paused, aware that billions were watching this ceremony across 3 civilizations, that his words would become part of diplomatic record studied by future scientists trying to understand how a technician and a junior observer had reshaped interstellar humanitarian operations. Also, he added, because she understands that sometimes the most important partnerships aren't formed through lengthy dating, but through the simple act of choosing closeness when staying apart would be easier, and declaring what your culture has recognized even when common sense would suggest staying silent. The bond is registered, Elder Kether announced. Let it be recorded that Daniel Tours and Alith Renshura are kinship bonded with joint authority over Krith humanitarian resources, and shared responsibility for refugee corridor operations. The formal words ended. But before officials could begin the standard post-ceremony procedures, Alith turned on holographic displays that transformed the diplomatic chamber into presentation space for evidence neither species could ignore. The kinship claim, she announced to the assembled witnesses, gives us authority that overrides normal administrative channels. We use that authority now to expose systematic sabotage that has prevented refugee resettlement while making profits for corporations invested in humanitarian crisis. The technical documents Daniel had put together appeared in the air above the ceremony platform. Routing rules changed to add delays. Communication setups deliberately messed up to prevent coordination. And patterns that proved months of failed agreements weren't due to diplomatic complexity but coordinated blocking. Unity Platform's communication systems, Daniel explained, his technical skills suddenly finding public audience, have been systematically changed to make sure humanitarian authorizations process slowly while commercial traffic moves at normal speed. These changes need high-level administrative access and match perfectly with corporate payments to shell companies linked to station officials. Alith's financial analysis appeared alongside his technical evidence. It showed the damning match between payment schedules and technical problems that had prevented refugee corridor implementation. "We're not claiming isolated corruption," Alith said firmly. "We're documenting coordinated conspiracy that has kept hundreds of thousands displaced, while Unity Platform administrators profit from the processing contracts that extended crisis creates." The diplomatic chamber erupted in controlled chaos. Officials demanding proof. Neutral observers turning on recording systems to document unprecedented accusations. And several Unity Platform administrators whose faces showed they were calculating whether denial or cooperation offered better chances for reducing their legal problems. "These are serious accusations," Station Administrator Chan said carefully. 3 months later, as Daniel reviewed technical plans for the expanded refugee corridor networks while Alith coordinated resettlement agreements with newly cooperative administrators from all 3 species, he thought about how thoroughly his quiet technical career had been disrupted by someone sitting beside him and whispering 7 words that changed everything. "You're smiling," Alith observed, entering their shared work area with reports needing joint approval. "Either the corridor numbers are better than expected or you're thinking about how absurd our lives have become." "Both," Daniel admitted. "Though I was specifically thinking about how everyone expected me to have a quiet career maintaining air processors. Instead, I got claimed by an alien woman whose whispered words in a crowded meeting led to exposing galactic conspiracy and joint administration of humanitarian operations. And do you regret that closeness led to partnership that destroyed your comfortable anonymity?" Daniel looked at her. This remarkable woman who'd recognized competence when he thought he was invisible, who'd chosen him as partner before he'd known he was being watched, who trusted him with authority he'd never wanted but was learning to use effectively. "Not even slightly," he said, "though I do sometimes wonder what my life would have been like if you'd chosen a different seat during that meeting." "Much more boring," Alith replied with certainty, "and significantly less effective at actual refugee resettlement." When you put it that way, being claimed through closeness seems like remarkably efficient partnership formation. That's because Krith culture understands that the best bonds are formed through shown compatibility rather than extended dating that can be done insincerely. Alith moved closer, the kind of comfortable closeness that had developed over months of joint work. "Also, your air processor maintenance records suggested you had the kind of systematic competence that would translate well to humanitarian coordination." "You based partnership decision on my maintenance records?" "I based partnership decision on months of watching that included your maintenance records, your equipment honesty, your refusal to participate in casual corruption, and the way you chose isolation during meetings, making your acceptance of my closeness a clear signal of compatibility." Her smile held warmth that showed watching had become real affection. The maintenance records were just initial data point. As they went back to reviewing humanitarian coordination reports, Daniel handling technical logistics while Alith managed diplomatic rules in the kind of seamless cooperation that characterized their partnership. Daniel thought about how his confusion about being claimed through whispered words had changed into understanding that sometimes the most important partnerships are formed not through formal dating but through recognition that competence matters. That closeness reveals compatibility, and that choosing to stay seated beside someone during a crowded meeting can reshape humanitarian operations in ways that years of diplomatic talks somehow failed to accomplish. Everyone else might have had conventional partnerships developed through extended dating and formal compatibility checks. But Daniel Tours had Alith Renshura, observer, strategist, and the woman whose whispered words had not only disrupted his comfortable anonymity but had exposed corruption spanning 3 civilizations. Proving that sometimes the most important words aren't shouted from stages but whispered in crowded meetings to people whose competence has been carefully watched, and whose acceptance of closeness signals compatibility that traditional dating would have taken years to confirm. And somewhere in the refugee corridors that their bonding had finally opened, thousands of families were finding safety because a Krith woman had noticed a human technician's integrity and decided that formal kinship claiming might be exactly the push needed to transform technical competence into humanitarian authority. And that sometimes the best way to announce partnership is to sit beside someone in a crowded space and whisper that your people have already recognized what will take others months to understand. That closeness chosen freely is the foundation of bonds strong enough to reshape the political landscape while accidentally creating partnerships that neither party planned but both were learning to treasure. 6 months after the ceremony, when the first major wave of refugee resettlement was declared complete and Daniel's air processors were finally working at reasonable levels, Alith gave him a gift that perfectly captured their partnership's unusual beginnings. "It's a holographic recording," she explained, turning on the device to show Daniel sitting in his corner during the meeting, reading technical reports while completely unaware of the Krith observer who'd been carefully positioning herself to claim the competent technician whose maintenance records had suggested he might be exactly the partner her people needed. "You recorded your approach?" Daniel asked with amusement. "I recorded the moment before formal claiming, yes. Krith tradition preserves the instant when closeness becomes partnership." Alith's smile held both affection and satisfaction. "I wanted to remember the look on your face when you realized that sitting in your preferred corner had made you much more visible than comfortable anonymity suggested. That look was pure confusion mixed with growing horror at social complexity." "That look was perfect," Alith corrected. "It showed someone whose competence had been recognized, whose integrity would be honored, and whose acceptance of unexpected closeness would reshape humanitarian operations while creating partnership that neither of us had planned but both were starting to appreciate." Daniel pulled her close, comfortable with the kind of closeness that had changed from cultural rule into real affection. "You know, when you sat beside me and whispered that your people said I was yours, I thought it was either wrong translation or the boldest romantic move I'd ever experienced. It was formal kinship claiming done according to rules your culture doesn't share," Alith replied. "Also, it was reasonably bold romantic move wrapped in strategic necessity." "The best kind of romantic move," Daniel said. "The kind that serves humanitarian purposes while accidentally creating partnerships that go beyond the political calculations that brought them together." As they reviewed the final resettlement reports, hundreds of thousands of refugees finally home or safely moved because whispered words in a crowded meeting had created authority that corporate conspiracy couldn't override. Daniel thought about how his preference for quiet corners had been permanently disrupted by someone who understood that sometimes the most important bonds are formed through closeness chosen freely. Words delivered as whispers rather than shouts. And recognition that competence, integrity, and the simple act of sitting beside someone can reshape the galaxy in ways that years of diplomatic ceremony somehow failed to accomplish.